Hey, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today on incident response planning. We're going to talk about 6 steps to prepare your organization for incident response. My name is Sam Abadier. I'm the Director of Product Alliances here at LockPath. And if I can get my slide to change. There we go. I'm the Director of Product Alliances here at LockPath. And with us today is Jeff Wilder. Jeff Wilder has over 15 years of experience in information security. Prior to joining Kirkpatrick Price, where Jeff is a director, Jeff was a trainer for the PCI Security Standards Council, where he's responsible for educating individuals working towards becoming qualified security assessors. In his role of director of PCI services at Kirkpatrick, Jeff is responsible for all aspects of PCI services, including incident response. Before we really get into this and pass this over to Jeff, a couple of housekeeping items. First, you have on the right-hand side of your screen a GoToMeeting webinar control panel. So that webinar control panel has put you on mute, and you'll be on mute for the entire time here. But I don't want that to discourage questions. If you look, you'll see a tab on there that says questions. Feel free to open that up, type in your question. We will receive that over here, and at the end of the session today, we'll go through all the questions. Either I will answer them or Jeff will answer them, and we will make sure that you have a full understanding of what it is that we're talking about. So with that, let's go ahead and send that off to Jeff.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me today. This is one of my my true passions is making sure that organizations really understand the value of making sure that they're secure. I personally have a belief that those organizations that are chasing compliance, that they're really kind of focused on the wrong things, and incident response is one of those things that I often talk about that organizations just don't get. Many times we have a security framework, we have a compliance framework that says go have an incident response program, but what does that really mean? And so we wanted to spend some time today with your customers and your clients and the people that have joined us on the phone today to kind of talk about what does an incident response program look like? What are the things that from an assessment organization, from a security and compliance organization, that we provide and we give guidance to and we look for when we're assessing organizations, and what is a good incident response program? And so we want to take a few minutes and have those conversations. So Sam, just want to thank you for having us here. For those of you on the call that have been in some of my conferences before, for those of you who do not, my name is Jeff Wilder, and I am the Director of PCI Services here at Kirkpatrick Price. So we want to spend a little bit of time in talking about really what is an incident response program. And really an incident response program, the intent of having a program in place is to minimize the impact should an event occur. And there's many things that go into developing that, right? We have policies, we have procedures, we have tools, we have staff training. There's all types of things that are involved, and we're going to spend just a little bit of time scratching the surface of some of these things. But really, it's a predefined approach in how to answer, a security threat, a risk, or something that has come to fruition within our environment. The purpose of doing this is that if we do not have an appropriately planned and trained and staffed incident response program, these attacks that are happening in today's environment are going to go on in perpetuity. So this means that we have to appropriately plan, train, and making sure that we have everything that we need in place. Right, so we're gonna set a plan together. We're going to put a plan in place. We're going to communicate it. We're going to practice it. We're going to look for process improvement. But we want to make sure that this plan is written such to the level that you don't want people standing around in the event of an issue, standing around looking at each other and saying, "Oh my God, what do we do now?" Right? And if you haven't trained staff, you'll inevitably have the employee that runs off and calls the media and says, "Hey, guess what? We've been breached." Without those types of trainings about who has a proper authority for communications, things like this happen, right? So the purpose of the incident response program is to have a plan in place to minimize the input or the impact of any adverse event that would happen within your environment. Okay. So we can never prevent an incident, right? They're bound to happen all day long. We need to have a clear understanding, though, from our organizational perspective is, when does an event, when does that become an incident, right? And so if they're not handled properly, first of all, we need to go through the process of defining what is an incident in our environment, what is an anomaly. When does the fact that somebody logged in at 3 o'clock in the morning become something that we need to review, right? And really having a documented incident response program is going to help to minimize the impact in the event that there's some type of catastrophic. We've seen a lot of breaches in the last couple of years, right? Some of them pretty big. I know for a fact, I just read the statistics here a couple of days ago that the breach Target alone, the breach that happened to Target has cost that organization, now we're up to almost $500 million. It's $493 million it's cost them, either in lost opportunities, lost sales, or actual direct fines. One of the things that most organizations need to understand as well is that your incident response program is just not a technology thing, right? We need to look at people, we need to look at process, right? If there's things that could happen that would cause work stoppage, some companies might be able to sustain that for a short period of time, and some, if you're not prepared for it, though, that impact could be, pretty devastating. So we want to make sure that when we look at, our incident and we do our planning, that we're also looking at, the people and the processes as well. Now, at the end of the day, we're all here to pay our bills, right? We need to generate money. We need to generate shareholder value. We need to generate, something back to the organization. But at the end of the day, it's really about generating revenue. Right, and if we have a work stoppage, if we have a situation where we're breached, these organizations that haven't properly planned end up having that that cost of $500 million out-of-pocket expenses. So either like I talked about Target, if you're well planned and well trained, you can minimize that impact to your revenue stream, whether it be from fines or loss of good faith from a from an organizational perspective. Now, one of the most important things that we often have to talk about, and most organizations don't really take into account for, is the loss to their brand, right? Look at how much money and time and energy your organization has spent building a good brand for itself. During the Target breach that happened a couple years ago during Christmas time, one of the reports that came out in Bloomberg is that it lost that company $300 million in lost sale. People just stopped buying there. Now, people have come back. They're now buying it, but you can never go back and you can't cry over the spilt milk. You can't go unring the bell, right? That money, that lost opportunity is, or that there's a lost opportunity there that these organizations didn't necessarily account for. Right, so the other part of why we would have a good incident response program is to make sure that your organization has the necessary controls in place. Okay, so in order to have a good program, it's always going to start with your policies and procedures and a good risk assessment program, right? So your policies and procedures should take an opportunity to educate your staff if you haven't already developed the documents. It's pretty easy to put together a policy, but you need to spend some time in developing a good procedure, okay? We need to put together an incident response team. Now, your incident response team is just not one person. It's just not the IT person. It should include HR. It should include legal. It should, include any customer relations. It should include the people as your help desk, right? There's a plethora of people that need to be involved in defining who your incident response team is. Now, as a second note to that, understand that everybody in your organization has some responsibility during a breach, whether that be the people that run the front lines. It should be at least trained in knowing what to do if they suspect something suspicious, right? And then it should flow on up the management chain, okay? Now, the other thing that we need to talk about is that having an incident response planning, having it documented, is only the first step. We need to train and we need to test it, making sure that management has the assurance that the program is going to function as they believe it is and as it is defined. Okay. So moving on here. So within your incident response program, we've already kind of talked a little bit about. Now, this may be 2 or 3 people, it may be 50 people, but these are the roles that you're going to want to include as part of your incident response program, or your CIRT, your Computer Information Response Team. As well as to consider that not all incidences are IT-based, but we want to make sure that you have legal there. We want to make sure that we have HR involved. I worked with an organization that was that had went through the Katrina hurricane down in Houston many years ago, and they said, you know, Jeff, we accounted for all of the IT. We had backup facilities, we had backup data, but he says, you know, what we didn't account for is that employees just didn't show up to work. They stayed home and to take care of their families. And so, you know, having HR involved in taking in the human factor is so important as part of your incident response. Remember, it's just not about technology, it's people and processes as well. Public relations, right? You're going to, chances are, if you've had a large catastrophic incident, your name is going to be dragged through the mud, right? Especially if it's in the financial and the health industry. We see a lot of organizations that have been breached as of late. You know, having to respond to the public outcry for you know, having lost their clients' data. You need to make sure that you have a security team involved, and not just by title. We need somebody that has specific attributable skills in how to answer and how to respond to, from a security perspective, how to respond to these types of events. We're going to have general IT staff, right? We're going to have executive staff. At a minimum, in developing your computer information response team or your CIRT team, your incident response team, these are the roles that you need to have, at least from a consideration as you move forward with, you know, defining how to react to a specific type of incident. Okay. So when we talk about and look at incident response programs, there's typically 6 items that we look for or helping organizations define. Right. The first one is preparation. The next one is detection, identification, containment, remediation, recovery, and lessons learned. We'll spend a little bit of time here over the next few slides and talking about what are those things that we need to do, what are those things that we need to look at. Now understand that this isn't going to tell, this particular set of slides is not going to necessarily tell you this is how you build a security program, or this is how you build your incident response program. But at least at a minimum, what this is this is going to be able to provide you the things that you need to have conversations with your staff, with your executive staff, with your IT, you know, with your organization, to making sure that you have the right things covered. Okay. So the very first thing that the very first step in any incident response program is your preparation phase. And this is where you're putting the policies in place, you're putting the procedures in place, you're educating your staff, you're doing your research and finding out what are those things that in this area, as it relates to people, process, and technology, that can negatively impact us one way or the other. We're taking all that information and we're building actions around what to do when we find out, you know, or identify that there's an issue. Preparation phase is also where we look to train our staff. Understand that the preparation phase of your incident response program is not a one-and-done event. This particular phase of your incident response program should be ever evolving, right? At the end of the preparation phase, we have the process improvement or lessons learned, right? What is it that we can do better? You should always be evaluating yourself. What better tools can we use? What better services can we use? Okay. The next phase of the incident response program is your detection identification. Now, this is the phase where you're putting the tools in place to identify whether or not, you know, you're doing your log review, your log monitoring. Now, understand that this particular phase is going to have, you know, training involved as well, right? How do we know, you know, what is the difference between an event and an incident? You know, as I've talked about, you know, the fact that your administrator logged in at 3 o'clock in the morning, is that an issue? But what happens if the same administrator logs in 15 times unsuccessfully in 4 seconds at 3 o'clock in the morning, right? Is that an incident? You know, and until we've done the analysis to define what are those anomalies, what are those things that we want to learn that are happening in our environment, and then establishing the tools and the methods and the means for execution of that, or to identify that, right? We're going to be left without the ability to really have the a view into our environment. So really we need to first define what are those things that we're interested in knowing about, and ask yourself, how do we identify this, right? How do we identify, a rogue employee or somebody that's pushing code into production that shouldn't have access, right? How do we go about doing that, right? Who are we going to be reporting to, right? The other thing that we need to consider is, how are you detecting malicious activity? You can see in the industry, in the malware industry, that things are kind of moving away from the random nuisanceware, or we've always called it malware, and we kind of went into this phase of where organizations have malware that they'll get installed on their box. It just scrapes information and sends it off, and we've kind of moved into this in the last 2-3 years. We've moved into this new phase of the zero-day attack, or somebody that's writing code that's specific for your environment, that's looking to exfiltrate that information. Can you say with 100% certainty that you have the ability to detect if that information, if you have health information and somebody's porting it and zipping it up and encrypting it and sending out your network, right? There was a company in Tennessee here about 3 years ago, a large health firm that got busted by the heartbleed, right, and lost information there. So the things that I'm talking about are not just theoretics. These things are real. We have to account for how we're going to be able to effectively detect and identify, right? The other thing is that please make sure that in this phase where we've defined our log monitoring program, is that the person that you want monitoring your logs is not a low-level staffed person. These should be very highly skilled individuals able to detect and discern whether or not that this is just kind of a random event, or yes, indeed, this is something that we need to be considerate of. All right. So the next phase of your incident response program is we've planned for it. We have the processes and procedures in place for identification and detection that there's something going on. Now, understand that during that identification phase that we just talked about, there's really two parts of that. One is the planning for, right, and then the other one is the execution of. So when we come to containment, this really has two kind of phases as well within this. We have the planning, right, where we can identify these are the things that we're going to do to stop the proliferation of these particular vulnerabilities that we're susceptible to, or the attack that we're under. There's the planning for it, to actually then planning it, testing it, and then executing on it. The point of this particular phase is we want to make sure that if somebody is in our network, if somebody is doing things nefariously, that we have processes in place to prevent the attack from going further. If you have a mainframe that has financial information, and you've identified that Hacker Joe is now in that mainframe and is doing nefarious things there, you want to make sure that they're not able to get to your other environment. So after the identification and detection, we have the containment. How are you going to stop, right, the attack from going any further? You have to be considerate of the people that are on the notification chain. Is it appropriate to do an all hands on deck, or just to pull, very few specific people involved that might only based on a need to know, right? There might be different situations where it's a health issue, right? Somebody has fallen incredibly ill, or somebody has brought a contagious disease. How do we stop, from an incident response perspective, how do we stop those things from occurring? The other part of this is, during the containment is, and we'll talk about recovery in a moment, but, what is the evidence that you need to be collecting during this containment? Now, understand that there's going to be a lot of situations that you might get into where the attack that you've been under, or the event that's been perpetrated against you, might lead to some future legal action, right? And so this is one of the reasons why we talk about having legal involved. So do you understand, what the damage is within your environment? How can you determine that? How can you measure it? Would you look for a numerical, financial number? Would you look for something that just relates to we suffered a 7 out of 10, whatever that means. But being able to assess the scope and the breadth of the damage is really important, okay? And then lastly, as part of this, as I've talked about, is, really the containment is how can we prevent further damage from occurring? Make sure that your IT staff are involved in this. Make sure that your legal staff is involved in this. Make sure that the executive staff is involved in at least setting the plan forward, making sure that everything is being done according to their wishes. Now the next phase is the remediation, right? So we've contained it, right? Now how do we fix it? So the recovery in continuity that we'll be talking about, understand that we're just not talking about, the remediation. We're trying to plug the holes in this particular phase, right? So do we have backups in place? Well, understand that, if you've been backing up a system that's been compromised, and you restore that system, you might be restoring, settings that allowed the person to get in the first place. The other thing that you need to consider is forensics analysis. Depending on the type of data that you're using or accustomed to interacting with, the type of data that might have been breached, you may be required to perform some type of forensics analysis and to determine whether or not that what was lost and where it was lost and how it was lost, so that you can fix those types of problems. You need to consider, how are we going to issue, or just stand up a new server, making sure that it's clean and that it's not susceptible to the things that caused us to be breached in the first place, okay? As part of this remediation, we're not just looking to making sure that the bad people are out of your network, right? We're also making sure that your organization's security posture and those things that led up to the breach or the event have been put in place to prevent them from happening any further, okay? The next part is recovery, right? So as we kind of mentioned before, right after as we come into this recovery phase, it's how do we make sure that we can still continue to service our clients? If you're in the healthcare industry, right, you have availability requirements. If you're doing government contracts in the financial industry, right, you have availability clauses. A lot of you might have an SLA, right, that says we have to maintain this type of uptime. Understand that the recovery is just not about making sure that your systems are still able to, sell their widgets and to provide the services that you sell or provide to your clients. It's about also recovering your security program. It's about making sure that your security program has fixed those things that we just talked about in the remediation phase, making sure that the organization has processes in place to ensure that they still can continue to serve their clients, but yet do it in such a way that they're not going to do that and compromise, right? So it's about recovering, and restoring your systems. Now understand, as I've talked about, if you're backing up systems that are compromised and you go to restore those systems are still going to be compromised, okay? We look for, in terms of from an assessment or from a consulting perspective, is that we look very heavily in this recovery process. Understand that as part of the recovery, in the next phase that we'll talk about will be the lessons learned. It's not about pointing fingers and said, you did bad and you did good. These are management exercises to making sure that their organization can function and serve their clients as they're contractually obligated to, or as you need to. Okay, you're going to consider ransomware, right? When planning recovery, we see a lot of the hard drive encryption ransomware that's now put in place. What I would recommend that you do is consider going out and buying Bitcoin. That's the only way that you can get your hard drives decrypted, is by paying off some of these ransomware. If you're backing up the data and it's being backed up encrypted, guess what? You have encrypted backed up data. You're not going to be able to get to it. So ransomware is something that we're seeing very prevalent in the marketplace. If it's not something as part of your incident response program, I would highly recommend that you look at those look at that as a topic of concern. Okay. Now, lastly, here is the sixth step that we have, is our lessons learned. And in my opinion, this is probably one of the most important steps. Now, most organizations are going to want to test their plan and I would recommend testing it in entirety. but make sure that part of your testing program as well has the lessons learned. And as I said earlier, it's not about pointing the finger and said, you know, Johnny did well and Susie did bad and Betty did really well. This is a management exercise to ask, why did this happen in the first place? What are the things that we can do to prevent this thing from ever happening again? This is really the process improvement. When I talked about in the very beginning is that we have the preparation phase. That is really kind of a continuous process. Understand that this lessons learned phase becomes the output of this, becomes the input into the preparation phase, right? So questions that you're going to want to ask is what happened and why did it happen, right? Where were the gaps in our controls, right? Was it a person? Was it a process? Was it a technology? And understand that the issues aren't always necessarily technology based, and so a lot of times, your lessons learned really needs to look at, can we change our processes? It's important to have tools in place, have the right people trained, but look at processes, people, and technology as part of this lessons learned, and not just the person aspect. Right. One of the important things that this is going to do is being able to quickly restore your environment, restore your services, and correct these things from happening again. It's going to pay off in spades, right, when you're able to regain that customer confidence that you're okay to do business with. Right. You're going to look at your policies and your procedures and ask, are the policies that we have, do they mandate and require the sufficient controls to be established in order to prevent this happening from again? And if it's not, then you would create those policies, you would create the necessary procedures, and then once again, part of that preparation phase is documenting and training your staff. So those are the 6 steps that we have in an incident response program. And I want to spend a little bit of time now in just talking about, what are the things that we see in the industry. And I've got a couple of slides here that I want to show you and just quickly talk about. But these are the things that happen when an organization doesn't appropriately plan, test, and train, have the appropriate tools, have the appropriate people in place, or have the lack of ability. We talk about lack of forensics analysis here as the last part of this, right? Not being able to identify really what happened and how it happened. Okay. So this particular slide is something that was pulled off of Bloomberg a couple of months ago. And effectively, this attack happened November 30th through, I think, December 2nd. Effectively, what had happened here is Neiman Marcus, so it's a large retailer, a high-end retailer here in the United States, and they were compromised. And what is interesting about this particular slide is the organization had alarms going off like slot machines, right? There was lights and there were 60,000 individual logged events that were in their environment, that were within they had this tool called FireEye that had 60,000 alerts that they had been compromised. But yet the organization, as the reporter wrote here, had the company security team responded to it as they were supposed to, the hackers never would have been able to get in there at all. This specifically happened because the organization didn't appropriately train their staff on how to react. They didn't have the right visions and right views, and they didn't have the right tools. There's something in the industry that we call audit fatigue, right? You sit somebody in front of a monitor literally watching the matrix waterfall trickle down their screen, and you get them for about 15 minutes, and then everything's just going to start looking the same. Right, and so it's really important when I talk about, as part of that preparation phase, to be able to identify when is this an event now considered an incident. And here's a really good example of that, right, where they had all of the notifications, but yet they ignored them. Okay. It's important that you plan, right, and you have processes in place for the timely response, and you get it in front of the right people, making sure that the right people have been trained to do the right things. Here's the report on Neiman Marcus, where there was 60,000 alerts. We look at the breaches that happened at a Target on the last slide, where organizations had notifications of it yet, but they ignored them. So it's really important that you spend the necessary time in training your staff. and you're able to identify, and teach your staff, you have all of these great tools, but understand that these are just tools to alert you to the fact that there's something going on. It takes that human connection to be able to really interpret and to extrapolate when is this now escalated from just being an anomaly to now we have something that we need to investigate. Okay, so I want to turn it back over to the team here at LockPath, and I'll be available at the end of this presentation should anybody have any questions. So Sam, thank you for allowing me to present kind of the short version of my my presentation here, and I'll go ahead and let you take it back over.
Hey, that was really informative. Thanks a lot for sharing that with us. I do have a couple of brief slides that I want to share with you guys. The first, as we're talking about the incident response, Jeff had brought up a process, and he talked about a number of different players and things like that. And a good organization that's going to have incident response generally is going to have the executive support that goes along that, and Jeff touched on that in his conversation. And when we look at that, there's different people that actually help with this process underneath. The first is your organizational incident response. And as we talked about, there's different types of incident response within an organization, right? We're going to have, let's say you work in a bank or a manufacturing company or something like that. An accident is going to have a different incident response plan, and that plan is going to have different needs and different communications and different people involved potentially than, let's say, something like a hack within your IT department, right? You're going to have different ways you're going to want to alert the public and things like that if something happens, right? If you're on a construction site and somebody gets their foot run over with a bulldozer, that'll make the news, but it's probably a one-day thing, and maybe you have a visit from OSHA or something like that, and that all has to be part of your incident response plan. But if you have a hack and somebody steals all of your employees' social security numbers, there's a different perception within the community and the world of what that looks like, and your incident response plan likely is going to have a different level to that. So besides your incident response team, which are going to be people who are trained, and you're going to have processes in place that will involve those, you have the detectors within your organization. These are the people that actually witness what's going on or notice what's going on, right? It could be third parties, it could be customers, it could be vendors, it could be internal folks, it could be people that are customer facing, it could be the guy that's reviewing the logs, right? Earlier in the presentation, Jeff was talking about, here, we reviewing logs weekly or regularly, whenever that is. If you're that type of person, or maybe you found a accounting incident, right, some sort of fraud, that comes in from the back office, how are you reporting that? How are you actually getting that information to the right people? And then how does the incident response team interact with those folks? How do they know what to ask them, how to ask them, things like that. So if we look at the 6 steps that Jeff had talked about, preparation, detection, containment, remediation, recovery, and the lessons learned, when we look at that, think about today how that is actually managed, right? Think about the procedures and how those procedures, because Jeff talked a lot about not just having a plan, but the actual procedures that go along. How are those procedures managed? A lot of times we're using tools like Word to draft up what the procedure is, and it's not just a single procedure. I mean, again, from what we just talked about, you're likely going to have multiple different procedure types, right? You're probably going to have Excel spreadsheets that are passed along with this. Maybe they're used to collect data in a simple way that can maybe be a little bit more organized or reported on differently. And think about somebody slipping and falling in a bank lobby versus a breach of data, right? You're going to have different types of spreadsheets with different types of information, things like that. Maybe it becomes a little unwieldy and you have an access database that goes along with that to help manage that. Eventually, you're going to have to communicate this information to people. Reports are often, and summaries are often given in tools like PowerPoint, right? The procedures themselves are going to be wildly different. We might have tools like Visio that are out there and helping diagram what those are. And as soon as the process changes within the business, in my experience, I've not seen the immediate change of the incident response plans the immediate notification that generally comes in an annual review or biannual review or maybe a quarterly review. But then we've got to go through all the different things that we have to see what's actually impacted and how that incident response might change. And then how do we actually do this communication, right? The most used workflow pattern to help manage this type of stuff is Outlook, right? It's just sending emails to people, and then you have to look at your Visio document to figure out who do I send my email to next, who has to get this next, or what's my group that has to be sent to next. And as you look here, what you're seeing is the tools that are traditionally used to manage incident response are actually clouding up the process altogether, right? It's kind of hard to see what your your entire process looks like because it's being covered up by the tools. So one of the goals of GRC platforms is to remove that cloudiness and make it so that the process is what stands out, the overall arching process, and then the procedures themselves are managed directly within the tool itself. So when we're talking about something like Keylight is an application or is a platform that we make here, and it's made up of 7 purpose-built applications, including Incident Manager, right? So we're tying this in with Compliance Manager, Business Continuity Manager, Risk Manager, Security Manager for your technology assets, the Vendor Manager for your third parties. Incidents happen everywhere. Slips and falls can be listed as different types of things, as different types of risks. All the risks can have incident response if the risk is actually realized. So people actually take these 7 different applications, they combine them together to solve these different types of these different types of risks, including operational risk, which is generally where incident management happens. What the platform does is it consumes data from across the enterprise. We can actually issue assessments in there. And then this is kind of the big thing when we're talking about incident response. I can develop every one of my procedures. I can take the procedures that we have and actually systematize them within workflow. So Keylight itself will actually manage the entire response. And I can take that general response that we showed in the cycle form that Jeff was talking about, and I can actualize that for IT response, for your customer-facing response, for your retail side. I can actualize that for your back office. Every different part of the organization can take the 6-step model and tailor it to their specific needs and wants, so that they can actually get to quickly and efficiently through that response. We have to remember too that incident response is often sadly followed up with a lawsuit or something like that, right? Incident response is very, very important, and being able to systematize this and to act quickly often will preserve the evidence that's needed and show good faith within any type of lawsuit or legal actions, and help, and can oftentimes help, remediate any legal actions and things like that that are going on. So all this it can be shown and presented through the reporting, whether it's that legal analysis and the request for information, or it's the actual process and who did what and when they did that. All of that actually is very trackable and actionable within the capabilities of consuming data, assessing people, performing the workflow, and then performing reporting. You'll get these slides a little bit later. These are just different ways that people group this together. But if you look, Incident Manager is prevalent through every one of these different types of solutions. So that's just a very short summary of how Keylight was able to actually actualize what it is that Jeff had talked about. I will invite anybody that's on the call today that if you'd like to see that, reach out to us. So we'll have on the next page some contact information. Reach out to us, and we can schedule some time to kind of figure out what's your industry, and then make it a very or what maybe what's your concern. Maybe not industry is not the right thing, but industry or concern. and we can find a way to actually show you in Keylight how Jeff's 6 steps would actually work. If you'd like to learn more about what we're doing here, we have some upcoming webinars. One's on business continuity management. And business continuity management is oftentimes a follow-on to incident, the things that are going on there. And then we have another webinar on the elements of effective operation within the vendor risk area, and how do you actually effectively manage vendors. And we do have some upcoming events. We are going to be at the Compliance Institute at the end of March, and that's at National Harbor, which is right outside of Washington, D.C. It's a beautiful venue right there. So if you happen to be in the area and you want to learn a little bit more, come swing by and find us over there too. And with that, I'll open up the floor for questions, or start talking about the questions that we have. It looks like we actually have a number of questions that have already come in. Let me just open this up. Person says, will the deck be sent out afterwards? And yes, we will send this out to you along with a link to the recording. So if you want to review some of the things that Jeff had said and get the context of the slides that he was talking about, you certainly will be able to do that. Jeff, if your line's open, I'm going to read this question to you and see if you can help with this. It says, where is the compliance person? The OCR and the federal government ask for the chief compliance officer always.
So, you know, I think that's a really good question. So understand that the chief compliance officer can be by title or by role. And it can be, you know, a single individual that fills multiple roles. You know, depending on the size of your organization, the chief compliance officer, understand that there's a difference between being compliant and being secure. Organizations that focus on, you know, being compliant, chances are they're really not compliant or they're really not secure. The role of the chief compliance officer really is kind of hand in hand with your chief information or your chief security officer. When they're looking for that role, they're looking for somebody that can basically answer to any of the compliance requirements. Why were these things not met? What are you doing? What is your due diligence, right? And without having somebody within that role at the executive level, typically we look for these roles to have some type of separation of duties from the IT and should be answering to the board. But it's absolutely imperative that you have, you know, whether it be a chief compliance officer or chief security officer, we need somebody that has the skills necessary to be able to, you know, to answer to those executive level questions about why were you not doing the correct things, you know, where were you doing, what evidence do you have to produce to justify, because remember, a lot of times these breaches that you have are going to lead to some type of litigation, right? And so you need to do everything that you can from the incident response program to protect, preserve, and to make it look like you're not trying to, you know, to hide things. The chief compliance officer is going to be critical in that role, making sure that, you know, along with your counsel, making sure that the staff have been appropriately trained in knowing what to do. So I hope that answers your question. If not, please feel free to reach out to me directly.
And hopefully you can see Jeff's contact information right there. The next question is, how does the 3 lines of defense for risk management align with your incident response plan? Jeff, I'll let you have that one.
So if we're talking about the 3 lines of security, availability, integrity, I would think that that's what we're referring to. Your incident response program has to do with, you know, really all of them, you know, business continuity, integrity, you know, your confidentiality, availability, and integrity. In each piece of, you know, making sure that things are confidential, right? That has to do with, you know, preventing the data from flowing out the back door in the first place. However, if it does, that, you know, then we look for that contained then within your recovery, right? The availability is making sure that you recover your systems in such a way that they're still secure. confidentiality is making sure that, that where the breach has happened, that the breach doesn't continue to happen. So once again, I'm not quite sure what the context of that question is about, but if you would like to go into detail about that, please feel free to reach out to me directly. I would love to have a conversation with anybody about these things.
And one more question just trickled in. What's the most difficult portion of your process?
Yeah, so I think the most difficult part is just the starting of it, right? The journey of 1,000 miles begins with that first step. In most situations, Sam, what I find is organizations really don't understand that there's 6 steps to incident response. Or what they do is they say our only incident response is addressing addressing virus that we've been notified through our virus console. The other part of this that's really difficult is it's really hard to, you don't know what you don't know. And one of the things that I would recommend is where you're in a financial industry, whether you're in a healthcare industry or whether you're in a service provider type industry, is find other peers within your organization, find other peers within your industry that you can have these conversations and talk about what are the things, what are the threats, what are the issues that we face, and what are those things that we can do. You can share information without sharing proprietary information or sharing your magic sauce. I think one of the most difficult things doing is finding the resources, whether in training those resources appropriately and knowing how to react. It's always, in any process that fails, it's always the human factor. We can spend, millions and millions of dollars in developing an incredible security posture, but yet, somebody will plug in a USB drive in their work computer that they found out in the parking lot. It's the most difficult part is training your staff and not just the people that are in your incident response team, but training all of your staff, right? Security training as a whole, and getting them to understand what is it that we need to do in the event of an incident. That is one of the most hardest things that I see in an organization is that they'll train a few people, but they don't train everybody. Remember at the beginning of this presentation, Sam, we talked about that everybody within the organization has some skin in the game. It's not just, the executive staff. It's not just the IT people. It's everybody, has some responsibility. And I think once management really understands the reason, the intent behind a thorough, comprehensive incident response program, often they stand there and look at me and like, wow, this is a lot of work. And, yeah, it is a lot of work. But if you don't do it, right, it's the potential for loss to your business, to your organization, to your shareholder value, to your faith within your customers. The list can go on. The damage that can happen to these if you don't properly train, I think is one of the most difficult things that most organizations don't do is appropriately train their staff and how to react. So good question, Sam.
That was a good question and a good answer that comes along with it too. So thank you very much. I haven't seen any more questions come in. I'll give it just another couple seconds here to see if any more questions come in. And I'm not seeing any come in. So with that, I think we'll close the webinar today. So Jeff, thank you very much for your insights and the presentation. It was a very good presentation with a lot of really good information. And for people on the phone too. Yeah, and for people on the phone, if you'd like to see that actualized in a platform dedicated to incident response, as well as other compliance and risk-related initiatives, please reach out to us. Our contact information is listed here, and we will talk to you again soon. Thank you very much.
Have a good day, everybody.